A routine night can twist into a reckoning that shakes an entire city, when a man who should have been invisible in his anonymity suddenly becomes the center of a storm that no one saw coming. A simple act, pumping gas, spiraled into humiliation, then into a courtroom drama where the balance of power flipped without warning. Those who once laughed and held control found themselves cornered by the very system they thought would protect them, while the one they targeted stood higher than they could ever imagine. This series pulls you into that descent and reversal, piece by piece, until the moment the truth becomes undeniable. Stay with me through the journey. Hit the like button if the story grips you. Subscribe for more accounts that force us to confront justice head-on, and drop a comment about your thoughts and where you're watching from. Late at night, Judge Langston Merrick, a 46-year-old black jurist with a reputation for fairness and composure, pulled his BMW into a gas station along Roosevelt Boulevard. He had just left Jefferson Hospital where his mother had undergone heart surgery, and though exhausted, he felt a small sense of relief that she was stable. Merrick was not dressed like the figure most people saw in the courtroom. Instead of his robes or tailored suits, he wore a navy blue hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers, clothes chosen for comfort during long hospital hours. To him, it was an ordinary evening ending after a long day, but to two white officers patrolling the area, Clive Rourke and Denton Hale, it was an opportunity to flex their authority. These officers were known in their department for high arrest numbers, and supervisors praised their productivity even as community members whispered about racial targeting. As Merrick slid his credit card into the machine and began fueling, he noticed headlights sweep across the lot. A police cruiser circled slowly, predatory, its occupants observing him with suspicion. Inside, Rourke nudged Hale and muttered, "Black male, hoodie medium build. Looks like the Wacth suspect from last week." Hale leaned forward, squinting at Merrick. Could be him. Their description could have applied to thousands of men, but that did not matter. Their cruiser cut sharply into the lot, blocking Merrick's car from leaving. Merrick caught their movements in his peripheral vision and felt a chill of recognition. As a judge, he had presided over countless cases where stops like this escalated, where men explained, pleaded, or resisted, only for their words to vanish into police reports rewritten with phrases like furtive movements or match the description. He had always believed in handling those cases with impartiality, but tonight impartiality was irrelevant. Tonight, he was the one in the crosshairs. Taking a measured breath, he reminded himself to stay calm, keep his hands visible, and comply with commands. He placed the pump back, tightened the cap, and turned to face the approaching officers. "Good evening, officers," he said with practiced evenness. "Is there a problem?" Rourke, adopting a stance of authority, stared him down. "Reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" The absurdity of the question struck Merrick. He gestured lightly toward the car. "Getting gas. I just left the hospital. My mother had surgery." But his explanation was brushed aside. "Let me see some ID," Rourke demanded flatly. Merrick narrowed his eyes slightly. "May I ask why?" "I'm simply refueling." Hale stepped closer, his hand hovering near his weapon. "You match the description of a robbery suspect. ID now." Merrick felt a bitter sting at the phrase. "Black male." That was the only description that mattered. He spoke firmly, announcing himself in the same tone he used to maintain order in court. "My name is Langston Merrick. I am a judge with the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas." Instead of respect, he was met with derision. Rourke smirked. "Sure you are, Judge. And I'm the governor. ID now." Merrick raised his voice slightly, not in anger, but in caution. "I am reaching for my wallet," he said clearly, his hand moving slowly toward his back pocket. But before he could retrieve it, Rourke grabbed his arm, yanking it behind his back and slamming him into the side of his car. His cheek pressed into the cold metal of the BMW, pain radiating across his jaw. "Stop resisting." Rourke barked loudly, though Merrick's body was rigid with compliance. "I am not resisting," he said firmly. "My judicial identification is in my wallet. This is unnecessary." Hale loomed nearby, ready to escalate further. one hand on his holster as though Merrick were a threat rather than a man pumping gas. "We'll check that downtown," Hale muttered dismissively. At that moment, a young white woman at a nearby pump gasped and lifted her phone, recording the interaction. "Is this really necessary?" she called out. "He's just filling his car." Hale shot her a warning glare. "Stay back, ma'am. Police business." From the convenience store, the manager, Raj Deshmukh, hurried out. A middle-aged immigrant who recognized Merrick from previous visits. He called out in alarm. "Officers, please, I know this man. He is a judge. He is a regular customer here." Rourke snapped at him. "Return to the building, sir, or you'll be interfering with a police investigation." Merrick struggled to keep his composure as Rourke tightened the cuffs around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. Humiliation seared deeper than the pain. This was not merely about him. It was about centuries of assumptions, suspicion cast on black bodies in white neighborhoods. Shoved toward the patrol car, he caught Deshmukh's eye and managed to say, "Please, call Diane Chun at the courthouse." "Let's go, Judge," he sneered, mocking Merrick's earlier declaration. Inside the booking area, the air reeked of stale coffee and disinfectant, a space designed for stripping away humanity. A heavy-set booking sergeant with thinning hair barely looked up as Rourke announced, "Got a loiterer from the gas station. Matches the robbery suspect description. Says he's a judge." Two nearby officers snickered at the statement, the sound sharp and derisive. Merrick lifted his chin, speaking with the same authority that once commanded courtrooms. "My name is Langston Merrick, judge of the Philadelphia County Court of Common Pleas. I am demanding my right to a phone call." The sergeant's eyes flickered briefly before settling back into indifference. "Sure you are. Empty your pockets on the counter." Still handcuffed, Merrick shook his head slightly. "I cannot comply while restrained. You are required to provide a phone call upon booking." His calm assertion of rights irritated them. The sergeant scowled. "Look, buddy, this goes a lot smoother if you cooperate. Empty the pockets." Rourke stepped forward and jerked Merrick's arms free of the cuffs. The sudden release brought physical relief, but no freedom. "There. Now do what the sergeant said." Slowly and deliberately, Merrick placed his belongings on the counter. Wallet, keys, phone, hospital parking receipt, a small roll of mints. The sergeant opened the wallet, flipping past credit cards until he found the judicial identification bearing the state seal. He paused but said nothing, sliding it aside as though it were meaningless. "Belt and shoes off." Merrick complied, the cold tile biting at his sock-covered feet. Every article surrendered another layer of dignity removed. He thought of the countless defendants who had stood here stripped of humanity, men he had seen as case numbers rather than human beings. He had listened to their testimony but never felt their humiliation. Tonight he felt it keenly, each step driving home how fragile identity could be when confronted with unchecked power. The room fell into a rhythm of paperwork and routine until a younger officer entered, coffee in hand. His gaze landed on Merrick, and his brow furrowed in recognition. "Judge Merrick?" the young man asked uncertainly. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Silence stretched across the room. Merrick turned to him, relief tempered by suspicion. "Yes, officer. And you are?" "Officer Kian Vassal, sir. You lectured at the academy last year. Constitutional rights during arrest procedures." Vassal's voice trembled slightly as he looked at his colleagues, clearly torn between loyalty and conscience. Rourke glared. "You know this guy?" Vassal nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. He is definitely a judge." The sergeant stiffened, glancing again at the judicial ID he had dismissed. Uneasy murmurs rippled among the officers. Within moments, a call was placed, summoning Captain Franklin Dorset, the precinct commander. Dorset entered briskly, his salt and pepper hair neat, his uniform pristine, his smile polished for press conferences. That smile faltered when he saw Merrick standing in socks beside the booking counter. "Judge Merrick," Dorset said, voice slick with forced warmth. "This appears to be a misunderstanding." Merrick met his gaze, unflinching. "Indeed, Captain, a misunderstanding of constitutional rights and human dignity." Dorset's smile wavered, but he tried to maintain composure. "Let's get your belongings back to you right away. Can I offer you some coffee?" "No, thank you," Merrick replied coolly. "I prefer proper procedure. I am entitled to a phone call, and I intend to use it." The captain hesitated before nodding vigorously. "Of course. Use the booking phone. Or if you'd like my office line, the standard booking phone will suffice." "I wouldn't want any special treatment," Merrick interrupted, the words carrying a razor edge. As he dialed Judge Diane Chun, his colleague and close ally, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Officers whispered, documents shuffled, and the sergeant typed furiously at his computer, suddenly eager to document every step. Through the glass of Dorset's office, Merrick could see Rourke and Hale gesturing wildly, their loyally rehearsed excuses already taking form. The porch light was on, and his wife, Althea Rowan, was already waiting at the door, her posture taut with both fear and fury. When Merrick stepped out of the patrol car and thanked Vassal for the ride, Althea rushed to his side, her eyes scanning him up and down as though to confirm he was unharmed. "Langston, my God, are you hurt?" she asked, her voice sharp with emotion. He shook his head slowly. "Not physically," he answered, but the edge in his tone betrayed the weight of humiliation. Inside the house, the air carried the faint scent of vanilla candles, but the comfort of home felt disrupted. In the living room, their children, 17-year-old Tobias and 14-year-old Nyara, sat glued to the television. The grainy cell phone footage of their father's arrest was playing on repeat, the caption screaming across the screen. "Philadelphia, judge arrested at gas station." Tobias shot to his feet, his phone clutched in his hand, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "Dad, we saw everything. It's everywhere. Everyone at school is talking about it." Nyara's wide eyes shimmered with tears as she whispered, "They slammed you against the car like you were nobody." Merrick gathered both of them into a hug, holding them tightly, as if to shield them from the harsh reality he could no longer protect them from. Over their heads he saw Althea standing with her arms crossed, her lawyer's mind already racing, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We're not letting this pass," she said firmly. "This is assault. This is racial profiling of the highest order. We will file a civil rights suit first thing in the morning. I'll call Michael at the ACLU, and we'll have injunction papers ready by noon." Merrick eased the children down onto the couch and gestured for them to sit. "Not yet," he said quietly, his calm tone at odds with the fire burning in his chest. Althea's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Not yet? Langston, they humiliated you in public. They slammed you into your own car, handcuffed you, dragged you like a criminal. And the entire country is watching that video right now. If ever there was a clear case for immediate action, this is it." Tobias clenched his fists, his voice rising. "She's right, Dad. They treated you like garbage. How many times have you told me to keep my hands visible, to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to never make sudden moves? You did all that, and it still didn't matter." Merrick looked at his son, his heart aching. "I did everything right. I identified myself. I moved slowly. I was respectful. And you're right, it didn't matter. Because to them, I wasn't a judge. I wasn't a father or a husband. I was just a black man in a hoodie at a gas station." His voice cracked slightly, and Nyara leaned her head against his shoulder. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why didn't they see you as who you are?" Merrick stroked her hair gently. "Because sometimes people don't see beyond the color of your skin. And that's why we have to fight for change." Althea paced the room, her frustration mounting. "Then let's fight. Let's use the outrage, the publicity, the national spotlight. We can file suits, hold press conferences, demand suspensions. You cannot just go back to court tomorrow as though nothing happened." Merrick's eyes hardened. "That is exactly what I intend to do. Tomorrow, I have a docket full of cases, and I will sit on that bench as scheduled." Althea stared at him, astonished. "After tonight? Langston, people would understand if you took time off." Merrick shook his head. "No, they need to see me there. They need to see that I am not broken, that the system cannot silence me with humiliation. And more than that, I need to show Tobias and Nyara that when you are knocked down, you stand back up. Tobias's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. But what if they try again? What if they don't care you're a judge? Merrick looked directly at his son. Then I will face it again. He had fielded calls late into the night from colleagues, from judicial allies, from civil rights organizations eager to represent him in lawsuits. He had turned them all aside with the same words, "Not yet." Althea had argued with him until nearly dawn, insisting that lawsuits were the path forward. But Merrick's resolve was fixed. His children had finally gone to school after tearful goodbyes, both of them watching him walk out the door as though he were heading into battle. In a sense, he was. At the courthouse, whispers followed him down every corridor, clerks and attorneys stopping their conversations to stare as he passed. His reputation had always preceded him, but never like this. He was no longer just Judge Merrick. He was the man in the viral video, the symbol of systemic failure and racial profiling. When he stepped into his chambers, his clerk Sophia was waiting with the day's files stacked neatly on his desk. "Judge Sanderson has called in sick," she explained nervously. "Food poisoning, they say. You've been assigned his docket." Merrick nodded, his expression unchanged, though something inside him stirred. He flipped through the files, scanning the names. When his eyes fell on the docket for a police misconduct hearing scheduled that morning, his chest tightened. The complainant was Antoine Johnson, a young black man alleging excessive force and racial profiling during a traffic stop. The accused officers were Clive Rourke and Denton Hale, the same two men who had slammed him against his BMW less than 24 hours earlier. Merrick closed the file slowly, his jaw tightening. He had not believed in coincidences for years, and this was certainly no coincidence. The system had handed him the very men who had humiliated him, not as defendants in his personal case, but as subjects of another citizen's complaint. It was a kind of twist he might have dismissed as implausible had it appeared in a courtroom drama. Yet here it was, real and undeniable. He rose, smoothed his robe across his shoulders, and prepared himself. Outside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters jostled with cameras, community activists held signs calling for justice, and uniformed officers gathered in groups, some glaring, some uneasy. When the bailiff opened the doors and announced the session, every seat inside was filled. Antoine Johnson sat at the plaintiff's table with his public defender, looking nervous but resolute. At the defense table, Rourke and Hale whispered to their union attorney, their posture casual until the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." The Court of Common Pleas for Philadelphia County is now in session, the Honorable Judge Langston Merrick presiding. As Merrick stepped onto the bench, the entire room seemed to inhale at once. Recognition spread like wildfire. Johnson's eyes widened, disbelief written across his face. The defense attorney looked puzzled, then alarmed as he connected the name to the headlines. And at the defense table, Rourke froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open, while Hale's complexion drained of color. Merrick took his seat with deliberate calm, arranging his files as though nothing were amiss. "Be seated," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension thrumming through the air. The crowd settled, but the whispers continued. He looked directly at the two officers, the very men who had mocked his identity, and allowed the silence to stretch. "We are here in the matter of Johnson versus the Abington Township Police Department, a complaint of misconduct and excessive force," Merrick announced. He paused, his gaze fixed on Rourke and Hale. "Before we proceed, I must acknowledge that I recognize these officers from a personal encounter last evening, which has been reported in the media." The room erupted in murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras clicking. The union attorney shot to his feet immediately. "Your Honor, in light of this admission, we respectfully request your immediate recusal from this case." Merrick had anticipated the motion. He leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but resolute. "Your objection is noted, counsel. I will hear formal arguments on the motion momentarily. However, let me be clear. The judiciary requires impartiality, not ignorance. My ability to separate my personal experience from the facts of this case is intact, and I intend to demonstrate that. Justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. He turned to Johnson, who was still staring at him in shock. "Mr. Johnson, are you prepared to proceed today?" Johnson hesitated before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor," he managed, his voice thick with disbelief. Merrick gave a small nod of acknowledgement before looking back at the defense attorney. "You may present your motion for recusal." The lawyer, a silver-haired Union stalwart named Stephen Grant, adjusted his tie and strode to the podium with the confidence of someone used to winning these battles. But even he seemed rattled by the extraordinary circumstances. "Your Honor," Grant began, "given your direct interaction with my clients last night, there exists a clear potential for bias. Judicial Canon 3 requires recusal when a judge's impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The appearance of impropriety alone necessitates your recusal in these proceedings. Furthermore, your personal knowledge of disputed facts creates an insurmountable conflict." Merrick listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Grant finished, he turned to the plaintiff's table. "Ms. Rivera, your response." Gabriela Rivera, Johnson's public defender, stood, her well-worn suit and exhausted briefcase a stark contrast to Grant's polished appearance. "Your Honor, we oppose the motion for recusal. The incident involving yourself and these officers is separate from our case. If anything, it provides valuable context regarding their conduct. The judiciary does not require recusal simply because a judge has relevant knowledge. By that standard, no experienced judge could ever preside over a case involving issues they have encountered before. You are capable of impartiality, and we trust the court to proceed." Merrick nodded once. "Thank you, counsel." He turned to the district attorney, Sandra Whitman, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "The Commonwealth takes no position on the matter of recusal," she said stiffly. "We defer to the court's judgment." Merrick considered briefly, though his decision had already been made in the quiet hours of the night as he studied judicial precedents in his study. "The motion for recusal is denied," he declared firmly. Gasps echoed across the room. Grant immediately began to protest, but Merrick raised a hand. "Your objection is preserved for the record, counsel. This court is fully capable of distinguishing between personal experience and the evidence presented. We will proceed." He turned back to Rivera. "You may call your first witness." Rivera nodded and rose, placing a reassuring hand on Johnson's shoulder before addressing the court. "The complainant calls Antoine Johnson." Johnson stood slowly, his movements deliberate as he made his way to the witness stand. He looked once more at Merrick, his expression a mixture of awe and determination, before taking the oath. As he sat, the courtroom held its breath, aware that what was about to unfold was no ordinary misconduct hearing. It was a collision of personal injustice, systemic corruption, and judicial resolve, all embodied in the man now presiding over the case. At the defense table, Attorney Stephen Grant bristled, his face tightening as he prepared another volley of objections, while officers Clive Rourke and Denton Hale shifted uneasily, their shoulders hunched, their earlier bravado drained away. The very idea that the man they had humiliated the night before now sat in judgment over them was something they could not have conceived, and yet the reality of it wrapped around them like chains. Grant returned to the podium, unwilling to let go of the only weapon he thought could save his clients. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a veteran litigator, "I must insist that the appearance of impartiality is just as vital as impartiality itself. Even if you believe you can separate last night's events from today's proceedings, the public perception of bias will irreparably taint these hearings. For the sake of the judiciary's integrity, you must step aside." Merrick regarded him evenly, the faintest flicker of irritation hidden behind his measured expression. He folded his hands atop the bench and leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Grant, your argument is understood. However, the judiciary does not retreat from its responsibilities simply because perception may be uncomfortable. Justice requires impartiality, yes, but impartiality does not mean blindness. The question is not whether I was present during an encounter, but whether I can rule based on the evidence presented in this matter. I am confident that I can and will." His voice carried across the silent courtroom with the quiet authority of someone who had weighed the arguments long before stepping onto the bench. Grant opened his mouth to press again, but Merrick's raised hand stopped him cold. "Your objection is preserved for the record," Merrick said crisply. "We will proceed." On the plaintiff's side, Gabriela Rivera exhaled a sigh of relief, placing a steadying hand on Antoine Johnson's shoulder. The young man's eyes flickered between the judge and the officers, the realization dawning that perhaps, just perhaps, someone in power might finally hold the system accountable. At the defense table, Hale leaned toward Grant, whispering urgently, while Rourke's jaw clenched in frustration. It was the first crack in their composure, the first sign that they understood the gravity of what awaited them. Merrick, refusing to allow the moment to stagnate, turned his gaze to Rivera. "Counsel, you may proceed with your first witness." Rivera rose and addressed the court. The complainant calls Antoine Johnson. Johnson moved to the witness stand, his steps tentative but resolute. The oath was administered, and he settled into the chair, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes darting to the officers who had tormented him. Rivera began with a gentle tone, understanding that the young man's credibility and composure would be attacked at every turn. "Mr. Johnson, please tell the court what happened on the night of March 14th. Johnson cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "I was driving home from my shift at the hospital. I work as a nursing assistant, and it was late, maybe around 11:30. I noticed a police car following me. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. They followed me for about 5 blocks before turning on their lights. They said my tail light was out, but when I had it checked the next day, the mechanic said it was working fine. They ordered me out of the car, said they smelled marijuana, but I don't use drugs. I asked them why I was being stopped, and they told me to stop being difficult." His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "Officer Hale pulled me out of the car, pushed me against the hood, and cuffed me. Officer Rourke kept shouting that I was resisting, but I wasn't fighting them at all. They searched my car and found nothing, but they still arrested me for resisting arrest." Rivera nodded gently. "And were you resisting?" "No, ma'am. I did exactly what they told me. I was scared, but I didn't fight. I knew better than to fight." The room was silent, every ear tuned to the raw truth of his words. Rivera asked him to describe how the experience made him feel, and Johnson swallowed hard. "Like I didn't matter. Like I was just another black man they could do whatever they wanted with." Merrick listened intently, his own memories of the night before resonating with every word. He maintained his judicial composure, but inside, the parallels cut deep. When Rivera played the cell phone video recorded by a passerby, the courtroom watched grainy footage of Johnson standing calmly as he was cuffed, his voice soft and compliant while the officers barked commands. The disparity between the reality on screen and the officer's official report was glaring, undeniable. Grant stood immediately when the video ended. "Objection, Your Honor. This footage does not capture the full context. We have body camera evidence that tells a different story." Merrick inclined his head. "Objection noted. You may present your evidence at the appropriate time. For now, the video will remain admitted." Rourke and Hale shifted again, their discomfort growing. They had relied for years on the presumption that their word would always outweigh that of their victims. Now, under the sharp eye of a judge who knew firsthand the sting of their tactics, that presumption was slipping away. Merrick's eyes scanned the room, noting the reporters scribbling, the activists nodding in grim recognition, the police officers shifting uneasily in their seats. This was no ordinary hearing. This was a crucible in which the credibility of an entire department was being tested. As Johnson stepped down from the witness stand, Merrick allowed himself a brief glance at Rourke and Hale. They would attempt to hide behind procedure, behind their attorney, behind the shield of the union, but he had seen the truth in their eyes. They knew the tide was turning. Grant approached again, still clinging to the motion for recusal, still trying to sow doubt. "Your Honor, I must reiterate that your presence here undermines the very integrity of these proceedings." Merrick's gaze was like steel. "Counselor, integrity is not preserved by retreat. It is preserved by the courage to face uncomfortable truths." This court will continue, and the evidence will speak louder than assumptions." He leaned back, letting his words settle. Justice does not bend to the fear of appearances. It bends only to the truth. He could not allow his personal feelings to dictate the proceedings, but he could not ignore the striking pattern either. Across the courtroom, Stephen Grant whispered harshly to officers Clive Rourke and Denton Hale, urging them to remain calm, reminding them that the Union had always protected its men. Yet their shoulders were stiff, their faces pale, as though they too recognized that the veneer of invincibility was beginning to crack. Gabriela Rivera, Johnson's attorney, rose with a measured determination. "Your Honor," she said, "we have additional witnesses prepared to testify regarding Officer Rourke and Officer Hale's conduct on prior occasions." Grant immediately shot up. "Objection. Irrelevant and prejudicial. We are here to discuss the incident involving my client, Mr. Johnson, not to re-litigate the past." Merrick regarded him coolly. "Objection is noted. However, pattern and practice testimony may be admitted if it bears relevance to establishing credibility and conduct. Proceed, Ms. Rivera." Rivera called two men, both black, who each told eerily similar stories of being stopped for vague reasons, subjected to rough treatment, and charged with resisting arrest despite having complied. Their charges were later dropped, but the damage to their dignity remained. Each man's story added weight to the sense that Johnson's case was no anomaly, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse. Grant cross-examined them aggressively, painting them as disgruntled citizens with axes to grind, but the seed was planted. The murmurs from the gallery told Merrick that the community present had no difficulty recognizing truth when they heard it. Then Rivera produced something that jolted the courtroom into a new level of intensity. "Your Honor," she said, "a new witness has come forward with material evidence relevant to this case." From the back of the courtroom rose Raj Deshmukh, the gas station manager who had witnessed Merrick's arrest. He looked nervous as he approached, clutching a laptop in his hands. Rivera guided him to the stand. After he was sworn in, she began gently. "Mr. Deshmukh, can you explain your connection to the defendants?" Deshmukh adjusted his glasses. "They come to my station many nights on patrol. I've seen them question customers, usually black or Hispanic customers, without clear reason." Rivera nodded. "And what prompted you to come forward today?" Deshmukh hesitated before answering. "After what I saw happen to Judge Merrick last night, I checked our security footage. We keep recordings for 2 weeks. I found something from the night of Mr. Johnson's arrest." He opened the laptop and handed it to Rivera, who connected it to the courtroom monitor. Grant leapt to his feet. "Objection. This evidence was not disclosed during discovery. This is highly irregular and prejudicial." Rivera countered smoothly. "Your Honor, the footage only came to light this morning when Mr. Deshmukh reviewed his archives. The defense had equal opportunity to request such materials from businesses in the area. The late disclosure is the result of witness initiative, not misconduct." Merrick considered carefully, weighing the competing arguments. At last he said, "The evidence will be admitted conditionally. The defense will be given time to review and respond. Play the footage." The monitor flickered and grainy black and white video filled the screen. The date and timestamp matched the evening of March 14th. The footage showed Rourke and Hale leaning against their cruiser at the gas station, sipping coffee and laughing. Their conversation was faint but audible. Rourke's voice could be heard saying, "We still need 2 more stops before the end of shift if we want to stay on top of the board." Hale chuckled. "Southside always gives us something. Hoodies, nice cars, you know the drill." The words hung in the courtroom like a poisonous cloud. Hale was clearly referencing the predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods in their jurisdiction, casually reducing entire communities to convenient quotas. Rivera let the silence stretch before speaking. "Mr. Deshmukh, do you recognize the individuals in this video?" He nodded. "Yes. Officers Rourke and Hale. They were there that night." Grant nearly shouted in desperation. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than idle banter between colleagues. It proves nothing." Merrick's voice cut through the tension. "On the contrary, Counsel, it may prove a great deal regarding motive and practice. Objection overruled. The evidence stands. The gallery erupted in whispers, some gasps audible. Reporters scribbled frantically, their pens struggling to keep pace with the story unfolding. Merrick studied Rourke and Hale carefully. Rourke's face was stone, his jaw tight with fury, while Hale shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering with the look of a man who knew the ground beneath him was collapsing. Rivera pressed further. Mr. Deschmuck, in your years managing that gas station, have you observed similar conduct from these officers? He nodded grimly. Many times. They watch black customers more closely, ask them what they're doing there, even though it's a gas station and they're buying gas. I've never seen them treat white customers the same way. Grant attempted to impeach his credibility, questioning his motives, but Deschmuck held firm. I came forward because what I saw last night with Judge Merrick was wrong, and I realized Mr. Johnson's case wasn't the first. It won't be the last unless someone stops it. Merrick allowed the testimony to sink in. He could see the ripple effect washing over the room. For years, officers like Rourke and Hale had relied on the presumption that their word would be taken as law, that their victims would be too powerless to be believed. Now the tide was shifting. The courtroom was no longer a stage for their authority, but a crucible exposing their conduct. As the day wore on, Merrick allowed further cross-examination, making careful rulings to preserve fairness. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind worked furiously. The evidence had cracked open a door, and through it, the entire system's rot was beginning to show. He thought of his children, of their fear, of the rules he had drilled into them about surviving police encounters. He thought of his wife's fury and her call for immediate lawsuits. And he thought of the countless defendants who had stood before him over the years, telling stories that sounded almost identical to Johnson's. Stories he had weighed with judicial caution, but had never truly felt until the night before. When court adjourned for the day, the officers left flanked by their attorney, their faces drawn tight. Rourke's scowl radiated defiance, but Hale looked hollowed, as if the realization of consequence had finally pierced him. Johnson and his family embraced quietly in the gallery, their relief tempered by the knowledge that the battle was not yet won. Merrick gathered his papers slowly, his mind already racing toward the next day's proceedings. Rourke and Hale entered looking markedly different from the cocky men they had been the night of Merrick's arrest. Hale's shoulders slumped, his eyes darting nervously around the room, while Rourke's jaw was clenched tight with defiance. Their attorney Stephen Grant whispered urgently between them, but even his confidence had waned. He knew they were bleeding credibility. Merrick opened the session without flourish, his voice calm but edged with steel. We will resume testimony in Johnson versus Abington Township Police Department. Counsel, call your next witness. Rivera stood, her posture strong, her eyes lit with determination. The complainant calls Officer Kian Vassell. Gasps rippled through the gallery. All eyes followed the young black officer as he walked to the stand, his uniform pressed, but his face tense. He took the oath and sat, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. Rivera began gently. Officer Vassell, how long have you been with the Abington Township Police Department? 14 months, he answered, his voice low but steady. And during your training and time on the force, what guidance have you received about traffic stops in different neighborhoods? He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the cluster of officers seated in the gallery. We were told to be vigilant in high-crime areas. And which areas were defined as high crime? Mostly the south and east sides of town, Vassell admitted, areas that are predominantly black and Latino. Rivera pressed further. Were you given specific instructions on what behaviors should be considered suspicious in those neighborhoods? Vassell hesitated, then nodded. Yes. We were told things like a black man driving a nice car in a white neighborhood was suspicious, or a young black man in a hoodie was suspicious, or that so-called furtive movements could justify intervention. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Rivera leaned closer. Did experienced officers ever coach you on how to write reports to justify stops? Vassell swallowed hard. Yes. We were told to use certain phrases, match the description, appeared nervous, made furtive movements. Those words made it easier for stops to hold up in court. Rivera allowed the silence to stretch before asking, "Have you observed officers Rourke and Hale engage in these practices?" Vassal looked directly at Merrick, his voice gaining strength. "Yes, many times. They were considered productive officers because they made frequent stops in minority neighborhoods. After Judge Merrick was brought in last night, I overheard Rourke say, 'Got another one,' before they realized who he was." The gallery erupted in gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and at the defense table, Grant's face turned ashen. Merrick raised his hand, restoring order, but the revelation had already sent shockwaves through the room. Grant stood immediately. "Your Honor, objection. This is hearsay, inflammatory, and irrelevant to Mr. Johnson's case." Merrick's gaze was steady. "Objection overruled. The witness is testifying to his direct experience within the department. His testimony will stand." Rivera pressed one more time. "Officer Vassal, what happened after the officers realized Judge Merrick's identity?" Vassal's voice was clear now, his decision made. Captain Dorsett told them to get their story straight. He instructed dispatch to alter the call log to make it look like there had been a complaint about a suspicious person matching the judge's description. He said, "Judges stick together, so we need to cover ourselves." The courtroom exploded into chaos. People in the gallery shouted, some in outrage, others in vindication. Merrick slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order. I will have order in this court." The noise died reluctantly, leaving an electric silence in its wake. Grant's face was crimson as he barked, "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We demand an immediate mistrial. These claims are unfounded and slanderous." Merrick's tone cut like ice. "Counsel, sit down. The testimony stands, and this court will not be cowed by demands that truth be buried. Your motion for mistrial is denied." Hale's composure cracked. He leaned toward Grant, whispering furiously, while Rourke's face burned with rage. Merrick observed them both, noting the tremors beneath their practiced facades. Rivera released Vassal, and the bailiff excused him from the stand. The young officer walked back through the aisle, his colleagues staring daggers into his back, but the community members in the gallery nodded at him with quiet gratitude. His courage had pierced the so-called blue wall of silence. After a recess, proceedings resumed with the defense calling Captain Franklin Dorsett himself. He walked to the stand with forced confidence, his uniform immaculate, his silver hair carefully combed. Under Grant's questioning, he painted a picture of a department committed to fairness, insisting that there were no quotas, no profiling, no improper practices. He denied giving instructions to alter logs, insisting that his men acted with vigilance, not bias. But under Rivera's cross-examination, cracks appeared. "Captain, do officers receive evaluations based on numbers of stops and arrests?" Dorsett shifted uncomfortably. "Activity levels are one factor in evaluations. And officers who do not meet those activity levels, are they penalized? They may receive lower evaluations. So in effect, officers are incentivized to make stops and arrests regardless of justification." Grant objected, but Merrick overruled. "Answer the question, Captain." Dorsett's jaw tightened. "That is one way to interpret it." Rivera leaned in. "And did you or did you not instruct dispatch to alter logs after Judge Merrick's arrest?" Dorsett's face flushed, sweat beading on his forehead. "I did no such thing." But the hesitation in his voice told another story, and Merrick saw it. The gallery saw it. The reporters saw it. The truth was pressing against the cracks, threatening to burst through. When court adjourned for the day, the air outside was electric. Protesters cheered Officer Vassal's testimony, holding up his name as a symbol of courage. Reporters shouted questions at Grant and his clients, who refused to answer, hustling into waiting cars. Captain Dorsett avoided the cameras, his earlier polish gone, his face a mask of strain. Merrick returned to his chambers, exhaustion etched into his features, but inside him, a fire still burned. Everyone in that room knew this was no longer about Antoine Johnson alone. It had become a referendum on policing itself. Officers Clive Rourke and Denton Hale sat at the defense table, their faces etched with strain. The prior day's testimony from Officer Vassell had been a blow, and Captain Dorset's faltering denials had left them exposed. Their attorney, Stephen Grant, wore the tight smile of a man clinging to a case that was slipping through his fingers. As the bailiff called the court to order, Merrick surveyed the room, his voice steady as he began. "We will continue proceedings in Johnson versus Abington Township Police Department. Ms. Rivera, you may proceed with your next witness." Gabriella Rivera rose, her every movement measured. "Your Honor, the complainant calls Officer Denton Hale." The courtroom gasped. Hale froze, his mouth falling open as Grant shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. My client is a defendant in this matter. He cannot be compelled to testify against himself." Merrick's gaze was cool. "Your client has not been criminally charged at this stage. He is a respondent in a misconduct hearing. The rules of this court permit his testimony, though he may invoke his rights as appropriate. The objection is overruled." Rivera gestured toward the stand. Hale moved slowly, each step weighted with dread. He took the oath, his hand trembling slightly, and lowered himself into the chair. Rivera approached with deliberate calm. "Officer Hale, describe your involvement in the stop of Antoine Johnson." Hale's eyes darted to Rourke, who glared at him with a look that demanded silence. Hale swallowed hard. We stopped him for a broken taillight." Rivera's tone sharpened. "Yet the mechanic's report shows the taillight was functioning. Did you confirm it was broken?" Hale shifted. "We believed it was." "Or was it simply a pretext?" Grant objected, but Merrick overruled. Hale stammered, "It was procedure. We had cause." Rivera pressed further. "And did you use the terms furtive movements and appeared nervous in your report?" Hale nodded reluctantly. "Yes." "Were those terms accurate descriptions of Mr. Johnson's behavior? Or were they used because you were trained that such language strengthens reports?" Hale's silence spoke volumes. Rivera's voice sliced through the stillness. "Answer the question." Hale exhaled. "We were told those terms help. It's how things are done." Gasps filled the courtroom. Rivera let the admission hang in the air before continuing. "And did you, Officer Hale, overhear Captain Dorset instruct dispatch to alter call logs after Judge Merrick's arrest?" Hale's face went pale. I heard him say something like that." A murmur erupted through the gallery, but the sharp bang of Merrick's gavel restored order. "Proceed, Ms. Rivera." Rivera leaned closer. "One more question, Officer Hale. Did you and Officer Rourke discuss quotas the night of Mr. Johnson's stop?" Hale hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Yes, we talked about meeting numbers." The courtroom broke into commotion. Rourke slammed his fist on the table, his face red with fury. "You coward," he hissed at Hale. Grant scrambled to contain the explosion. "Your Honor, this is improper. My client is being badgered." Merrick's voice cut through with icy finality. "Sit down, counselor. The testimony stands." Rivera released Hale, and he slunk back to the defense table, his eyes avoiding Rourke's searing glare. The damage was done. The blue wall had cracked further, and Hale's words had opened the door to truths long buried. Rivera was not finished. "Your Honor, the complainant calls Officer Clive Rourke." Gasps filled the room again. Rourke stormed to the stand with visible defiance, his jaw set. He took the oath with a sneer, staring directly at Merrick as though daring him to strike him down. Rivera's questions came quickly. "Officer Rourke, describe Mr. Johnson's behavior during the stop." "He was difficult. He questioned our authority. He resisted." "Did you include those claims in your report?" "Yes." Rivera displayed the body camera footage on the monitor. It showed Johnson calm, compliant, speaking softly as he was cuffed. "Where in this footage do we see resistance?" Rourke scowled. "The camera malfunctioned. He got aggressive after that." Rivera's voice sharpened. Conveniently, after the camera cut out, Rourke's face twisted. "That's how it happened." Rivera's eyes burned into him. "Or is it how you wrote it to justify the arrest?" Rourke's composure cracked. "We do what we have to do." You people don't understand what it's like out there." The gallery erupted, voices rising in outrage, some shouting, "You people." Merrick's gavel thundered. "Order. One more outburst, and I will clear the gallery." Rivera pressed on, her voice unyielding. "Officer Rourke, did you or did you not discuss meeting quotas with Officer Hale that night?" Rourke's fury boiled over. "Of course we talked about quotas. That's the job. We get evaluated on numbers. You think anyone cares how polite we are? They care about how many stops we make." The courtroom froze in stunned silence. Rivera's voice was low but sharp. "So you admit to prioritizing numbers over constitutional rights?" Rourke's face flushed, but he doubled down. "We do what we're told. Don't blame me for how the system works." Merrick's eyes narrowed. "Officer Rourke, this court will determine blame. You are here to answer questions, not justify misconduct." Rourke glared, his fists clenched, but he had already said too much. The unraveling had begun. Rivera concluded with one final blow. "Officer Rourke, did you or did you not hear Captain Dorset instruct that logs be altered after Judge Merrick's arrest?" Rourke shifted, rage and fear colliding on his face. He refused to answer. Merrick leaned forward, his voice firm. "You are under oath. Answer the question." Rourke finally spat. "Yes. I heard him. He said to cover ourselves." The gallery exploded into chaos, the truth reverberating like a shockwave. Reporters shouted, protesters outside roared louder, and Merrick slammed his gavel until order reluctantly returned. He dismissed Rourke from the stand, his face impassive, though his chest burned with restrained fury. The unraveling was complete. Hale had cracked, Rourke had exploded, and the wall of silence that had shielded them for years was crumbling. Merrick addressed the courtroom. "This court will recess until tomorrow. When we resume, we will hear from additional witnesses, and this court will not shy away from examining systemic issues raised by this testimony." As people filed out, Rivera clasped Johnson's hand tightly. He looked overwhelmed, but there was a new fire in his eyes, the fire of someone who had been believed. Hale left quickly, avoiding the cameras, while Rourke stormed past reporters. His words caught on microphones. "This is a witch hunt." The following morning, the courthouse was a fortress of noise and anticipation. The plaza outside had swelled with more protesters, more cameras, more signs demanding justice. And within the building, staff whispered that this was the most crowded they had ever seen courtroom 4B. The revelations from Officers Hale and Rourke had gone national overnight. Clips of their testimony replayed on cable news, while pundits debated whether the department's entire foundation would collapse under scrutiny. Inside, Judge Langston Merrick entered with a quiet dignity that had defined him his entire career. But this morning, there was a heavier weight on his shoulders. The system itself was now on trial, and he was the one guiding it toward a reckoning. When the bailiff called the court to order, Merrick scanned the room, taking in the packed gallery. Reporters sat elbow to elbow with community activists, police union representatives glowered from the back, and at the defense table, Stephen Grant looked more like a man managing a disaster than arguing a case. Hale's eyes stayed fixed on the table, shame clinging to him, while Rourke radiated defiance, his jaw tight, his glare fixed on Merrick. Rivera stood, her voice carrying determination sharpened by days of truth already revealed. "Your Honor, the complainant calls Commissioner Frank Hargrove." The room buzzed instantly. Hargrove, the head of the entire Philadelphia Police Department, had been subpoenaed after Vassal's and Rourke's testimony cracked open the door to systemic corruption. The tall commissioner walked to the stand, his polished suit impeccable, his expression attempting calm but betraying tension around the eyes. He took the oath and sat, his posture rigid. Rivera began with surgical precision. "Commissioner Hargrove, does your department have policies prohibiting racial profiling?" "Absolutely," he said firmly. "Our written policies explicitly forbid the use of race as a factor in stops or arrests." Rivera's voice cut through. "Then how do you explain statistical evidence showing Black and Latino residents are stopped at rates 5 times higher than white residents in your jurisdiction?" Hargrove shifted. "There are many variables: crime rates, deployment patterns, calls for service. Rivera interrupted. And yet when researchers control for those variables, the disparities remain. How do you explain that? Hargrove's jaw tightened. Disparities do not automatically equal discrimination. Rivera's eyes narrowed. But when we hear testimony from your own officers, from Hale, from Rourke, from Vassell, from community witnesses like Mr. Deschmuk, all pointing to a culture of quotas and coded language targeting minorities, does that not indicate systemic bias? Grant objected, but Merrick overruled, his tone sharp. Answer the question, Commissioner. Hargrove's calm veneer cracked. I cannot account for every officer's conduct, he admitted, but our policies are clear. Rivera pounced. Policies mean nothing without enforcement. Where are the audits, the reviews, the accountability? If your policies are so strong, why are officers rewarded for stops and arrests regardless of justification? Hargrove's face flushed. We expect our officers to act constitutionally. Rivera's final strike came swift. And yet they don't. And you know it. The gallery erupted, but Merrick's gavel restored order. The commissioner's faltering answers had shifted the momentum further, painting the entire department as complicit. Rivera then called Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a professor of criminal justice, who explained how terms like furtive movements and match the description were used as coded shields for profiling. She displayed charts comparing stop rates across neighborhoods, the disparities glaring. Her calm academic tone made the truth unavoidable. These disparities are not the product of random chance, she concluded. They are the predictable outcome of institutional incentives and cultural norms within the department. Grant tried to cross-examine, suggesting the data was incomplete, but Simmons dismantled his questions with ease. The patterns are consistent across multiple studies, counselor. They are systemic, not incidental. The juryless courtroom felt the weight of her words settle like iron. When the lunch recess came, cameras captured the crowd outside, chanting louder than ever. Inside, Rourke muttered angrily to Grant, his voice audible enough for reporters in the gallery to hear, "We're being sacrificed for politics." Hale sat apart, silent, his shame thick enough to touch. In the afternoon, Rivera produced sealed testimony from additional officers who had come forward under whistleblower protection. Their statements corroborated everything: that quotas ruled evaluations, that officers were coached to use magic words in reports, that challenging misconduct meant ostracism or career suicide. Merrick allowed the reading of these statements, overruling Grant's protests. "This court will not silence truth to spare embarrassment," he said firmly. The sealed testimonies were devastating, particularly one from an officer who described being explicitly told that a black man driving through Abington after dark is probable cause. The room shook with outrage, and outside the courthouse chants grew to a roar. Grant tried to shift the narrative, calling Captain Dorset again to insist that those practices were isolated. But under questioning, Dorset faltered, contradicting his earlier testimony and finally admitting performance metrics emphasized activity. Maybe that emphasis was misinterpreted. Merrick's voice was stern. "Captain, you testified under oath yesterday. Which version is the truth?" Dorset stammered. "The truth is complicated." Merrick's stare was cold. "The truth is simple. You've just admitted your department incentivized unconstitutional stops." The gallery gasped, and Dorset shrank in his seat. Finally, Merrick allowed Grant to call Rourke back to the stand, perhaps hoping to salvage something. But Rourke, bristling with anger, instead detonated. "This is a sham. You people don't know what it's like." The fourth day of hearings began with an atmosphere so thick it seemed to weigh on the shoulders of every person who entered courtroom 4B. Protesters filled the plaza outside, their chants echoing up the courthouse steps, while inside the gallery overflowed with citizens, reporters, and police officers whose faces betrayed tension, anger, or quiet hope. The revelations of the previous days had shattered illusions of isolated misconduct, replacing them with undeniable proof of systemic rot. Everyone knew that today Judge Langston Merrick would deliver a ruling that could either change the course of policing in Abington Township or reinforce the despair that had long settled over marginalized communities. Merrick entered the courtroom slowly, robe sweeping, his face composed but heavy with responsibility. He had not slept more than a few hours, the weight of his decision pressing relentlessly on his mind. As the bailiff called the court to order, Merrick looked across the room at Antoine Johnson, seated beside his attorney, Gabriella Rivera, his hands clasped tightly. He then turned his gaze to Clive Rourke and Denton Hale, seated with their attorney Stephen Grant, their contrasting postures striking. Rourke bristling with barely concealed fury, Hale slumped in quiet defeat. At the prosecution table, Commissioner Hargrove and Captain Dorset whispered nervously, aware that their reputations and perhaps careers hung in the balance. Merrick began. This court has heard extensive testimony regarding the complaint of Mr. Antoine Johnson against officers Rourke and Hale. What began as an examination of a single incident has revealed patterns of misconduct, cultural practices within the department, and systemic issues that demand resolution. Today, this court must decide not only this complaint, but also how to address the broader failures exposed. Rivera rose first, delivering a final argument that crackled with moral clarity. She recapped Johnson's testimony, the cell phone footage contradicting police reports, the corroborating accounts of other citizens, the damning security video from Raj Deshmukh, the admissions from Hale, the outburst from Rourke, and the courageous whistleblowing from Officer Vassell. Her voice shook slightly as she concluded, "Justice cannot be selective. It cannot apply differently depending on the color of your skin. Mr. Johnson deserves vindication, and this community deserves reform." Grant rose next, his voice strained. He attempted to frame the case as an overreach, arguing that isolated mistakes were being weaponized into an indictment of an entire department. But the passion had drained from his words, his usual poise eroded by the flood of evidence. He pleaded that his clients had made difficult decisions in the heat of duty, but the argument fell flat, sounding hollow in the wake of everything revealed. Merrick listened with the stillness of stone, taking notes only sparingly. When arguments concluded, he set aside his pen and removed his glasses, rubbing them carefully before placing them on the bench. Then he spoke, his voice low, but carrying the gravity of centuries of law and injustice woven together. This court finds that officers Rourke and Hale violated Mr. Johnson's constitutional rights. The stop was unjustified, the arrest unlawful, and the reports filed misleading. The evidence is overwhelming that race was a determining factor in their actions. Rourke shifted angrily, whispering harshly to Grant, but Merrick continued. However, this case has also revealed that their actions were not isolated. They were the product of a departmental culture that rewarded numbers over rights, that trained officers to use coded language to shield profiling, and that tolerated or even encouraged misconduct. Such practices erode trust, harm communities, and undermine the very principles law enforcement claims to defend. Merrick's eyes swept the room. This court orders the following remedies. First, officers Rourke and Hale are suspended without pay for 12 months. They will be required to undergo retraining in constitutional policing, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques before returning to duty, and their future performance will be monitored by an independent oversight committee. Second, Captain Dorset is referred to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into possible obstruction and evidence tampering. Third, Commissioner Hargrove is directed to implement immediate reforms, including the elimination of stop quotas, the establishment of independent civilian oversight, and mandatory auditing of all stops for racial disparities. Murmurs spread through the gallery, but Merrick's voice grew stronger. Additionally, this court orders a review of all arrests conducted by the Abington Township Police Department over the past 3 years, where the justification included vague phrases such as match the description or furtive movements. Each case will be re-examined for constitutional validity. The integrity of the justice system requires no less. Rivera pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. Johnson sat frozen, tears brimming, his hand clutching hers as though to anchor himself. Across the aisle, Rourke muttered bitterly, his face twisted with rage, while Hale simply closed his eyes, as if finally surrendering to the consequences. Merrick was not finished. He leaned forward, his tone shifting from judicial pronouncement to solemn truth. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about transformation. This community must rebuild trust. That cannot happen through verdicts alone, but through sustained effort, honesty, and accountability. The people must see that law enforcement is bound by the same rules as those of police. Without that, democracy itself falters. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch, every ear straining to catch his words. I have spent my career on this bench believing in the system, even while acknowledging its flaws. But only by confronting those flaws openly, as we have done here, can we hope to make the promise of equal protection real. He raised his gavel and struck it firmly. This hearing is adjourned. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a tidal wave of emotion. Applause broke out, chants of justice. Justice filled the air, while reporters rushed from the courtroom to broadcast the ruling. Johnson rose to his feet, embraced by his mother and siblings, tears streaming as relief and vindication washed over him. Rivera clasped Merrick's hand briefly, whispering, "You changed more than a case today." Outside, protesters cheered as word spread, their chants turning from anger to celebration. Cameras captured scenes of joy, relief, and determination, knowing that this was not an ending, but a beginning. In the weeks that followed, reforms began to take root. The Oversight Committee was formed, staffed not only by legal experts, but by community members who had lived the consequences of profiling. Body cameras were mandated and could no longer be manually deactivated. Performance evaluations shifted from numbers of stops to constitutional compliance and community engagement. Data on stops and arrests was published monthly, scrutinized by journalists and citizens alike. Officers like Hale, after serving suspension and completing retraining, returned under closer supervision, while Rourke chose to resign rather than submit to oversight, his bitterness making him a relic of a system being dismantled. Commissioner Hargrove, under constant pressure, eventually stepped down, replaced by a reform-minded chief who embraced the oversight process. For Merrick, the case left scars, but also renewed purpose. He continued his work on the bench, but also chaired forums on justice reform, his voice resonating with both authority and lived experience. Antoine Johnson used his settlement to return to school, studying criminal justice with the goal of helping others navigate the system that had nearly broken him. One evening, 6 months later, Merrick returned to the same gas station where it had all begun. He stood at pump 3, filling his tank, when a young black man at the next pump gave him a nod, a look of cautious recognition. A patrol car pulled into the lot, and for a moment, the old tension returned. But this time, the officer stepped out, greeted the young man politely, and asked if he needed help with his car battery. The young man exhaled slowly, nodding, and Merrick felt something shift deep inside him. Progress was fragile, incomplete, but it was real. He drove home that night with a sense of quiet resolve. Justice was never a destination. It was a journey, and in Abington Township, that journey had finally begun in earnest the end. If you followed this story all the way to the end, I'd like to ask for your support. Hit the like button if you believe stories like this should keep being told, and subscribe to stay connected as we share more powerful accounts of justice, struggle, and change. I also want to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot, especially the way Judge Merrick's final decision tied the whole journey together? Do you think justice was served, or should the ending have gone even further? And one more thing, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach, and it helps bring together a community of people who care about fairness and truth.